Deep within the heart of an ancient forest, where sunlight filters through towering canopies and the air hums with the whispers of time, there lies a place untouched by the chaos of the world. This is no ordinary forest, it's a sacred grove, a space where nature and the divine intertwine. Ancient peoples didn't just walk through these groves, they revered them, protected them, and saw them as gateways to something greater. But why? What was it about these spaces that inspired such devotion? Today, we're stepping into the lush, mysterious world of sacred groves and forests to uncover their profound spiritual, ecological, and cultural significance. Together, we'll explore how these spaces shaped ancient lives, beliefs, and rituals, and what they can still teach us today, ready to journey into the past. Let's begin. The concept of sacred groves stretches back thousands of years, woven into the very fabric of ancient civilizations. Among the earliest records, we find the Greeks and Romans dedicating lush, untamed forests to their gods and goddesses. These weren't just patches of land, they were sanctuaries believed to be the dwelling places of deities like Artemis, the goddess of the wilderness, or Jupiter, the king of the gods. For these cultures, sacred groves weren't just physical spaces, they were bridges between the mortal world and the divine. People would gather here to offer prayers, perform rituals, and seek guidance, believing that the gods themselves walked among the trees. But the Greeks and Romans weren't alone. Indigenous tribes across the globe also held sacred groves in high reverence. From the Druids of ancient Britain to the tribal communities of Africa and the Americas, these spaces were seen as living, breathing entities. They were often considered the homes of spirits or ancestors, places where the natural and supernatural worlds intertwined. For many indigenous cultures, these groves were not just places of worship but also centers of community life, where decisions were made, festivals were held, and traditions were passed down through generations. Archaeological evidence further cements the importance of these sacred spaces. Excavations have uncovered altars, offerings, and even entire temples nestled within these groves, revealing just how central they were to ancient societies. For example, in Greece, the remains of the sacred grove of Dodona, dedicated to Zeus, show traces of an oracle where people sought divine wisdom. Similarly, in India, ancient inscriptions and carvings highlight the role of sacred groves in Vedic rituals, tying them to the earliest forms of Hinduism. These findings don't just tell us about the past, they remind us of the deep connection ancient people felt to the natural world, seeing it not just as a resource but as a spiritual ally. This reverence for sacred groves wasn't just about religion, it was about understanding humanity's place in the universe. By dedicating these spaces to the divine, ancient civilizations acknowledged their dependence on nature's cycles, fertility, seasons, and life itself. It's a perspective that feels both ancient and strikingly modern, as we today grapple with our own relationship to the environment. The origins of sacred groves offer us a glimpse into a world where the land was alive with meaning, where every tree, stream, and stone held a story waiting to be told. For ancient people, sacred groves were far more than just clusters of trees. They were living thresholds between the earthly and the divine. These spaces were believed to be infused with sacred energy, places where the veil between worlds was thinnest. Imagine walking into a grove where every rustling leaf seemed to whisper messages from the gods, where the air itself felt charged with something otherworldly. These groves were not just places to visit, they were places to commune, to seek guidance, and to honor the forces that shaped their lives. In many cultures, these groves were seen as the dwelling places of deities or spirits. The Greeks, for example, believed that groves were sacred to gods like Artemis, the goddess of the hunt and wilderness. Offerings of fruit, flowers, or even animals were left in these groves to appease the gods and ensure their favor. For the Celts, groves were tied to druidic practices where rituals under the canopy of ancient trees marked the turning of seasons, the cycles of life and death, and the balance of the natural world. These ceremonies weren't just symbolic, they were vital acts of maintaining harmony between humans and the divine. Sacrifices, too, played a significant role in these sacred spaces. Some cultures believed that offerings of blood or precious items could open a channel of communication with the gods. In Norse mythology, for instance, sacred groves were often sites of blot, a ritual where animals were sacrificed and their blood was sprinkled on altars to honor the gods. These acts weren't about fear or coercion. They were acts of devotion, a way to give back to the forces that sustained life and ensured prosperity. But it wasn't just about grand rituals. Sacred groves were also places of personal spirituality. Individuals would come to pray, meditate, or seek visions. In some traditions, spending a night in a sacred grove was thought to bring prophetic dreams or divine insight. These groves were sanctuaries where people could step away from the chaos of everyday life and reconnect with something greater, whether that was a specific deity, the spirit of nature, or the essence of the universe itself. What's fascinating is how these beliefs transcended geography and time. From the oak groves of Europe to the banyan trees of India, these sacred spaces shared a common thread. They were seen as bridges to the sacred, places where the ordinary could touch the extraordinary. And while the rituals and deities might have differed, the underlying reverence for these groves was universal. They weren't just physical locations, they were spiritual gateways, a reminder that the divine was never far away, just waiting to be found among the trees. Sacred groves weren't just spiritual sanctuaries, they were among the earliest and most effective forms of ecological preservation. Ancient people unknowingly laid the groundwork for conservation by designating these spaces as sacred and untouchable. Protected by religious and cultural taboos, these groves became havens for biodiversity, shielding them from human exploitation and deforestation. Over time, they evolved into thriving ecosystems, preserving rare plant and animal species that might otherwise have been lost to history. One of the most remarkable aspects of sacred groves was their ability to maintain ecological balance. By setting strict boundaries around these areas, ancient communities ensured that the natural world could flourish undisturbed. Trees, some hundreds of years old, stood as silent witnesses to the passage of time, their roots anchoring the soil and preventing erosion. The dense canopy provided shelter for countless species, while the undergrowth teemed with life, creating a self-sustaining microcosm of nature's complexity. These groves often housed unique flora and fauna found nowhere else, making them invaluable to environmental preservation. Take, for example, the sacred groves of India's Western Ghats, where rare medicinal plants and endangered species like the lion-tailed macaque have been safeguarded for centuries. Similarly, in parts of West Africa, sacred groves have preserved ancient tree species and provided critical habitats for migratory birds. These examples highlight how cultural practices inadvertently became a lifeline for the natural world. The environmental importance of these groves extends far beyond their boundaries. By maintaining healthy ecosystems, they contributed to cleaner air, stable water cycles, and fertile soil, benefiting the surrounding regions. Their preservation wasn't just about faith, it was a profound lesson in the interconnectedness of all life. Today, as we grapple with deforestation and climate change, these ancient practices remind us of the wisdom in protecting nature, not just for its resources, but for its intrinsic value. Sacred groves stand as timeless examples of how cultural reverence can harmonize with ecological stewardship, offering powerful insights for modern conservation efforts. Sacred groves weren't just patches of untouched wilderness, they were the beating heart of cultural identity for countless ancient communities. These natural sanctuaries served as living archives, preserving stories, traditions, and wisdom that were passed down through generations. Think of them as the original libraries, but instead of books, they held the collective memory of a people. In many cultures, sacred groves were the settings for myths and legends, where gods, heroes, and ancestral spirits were said to walk among the trees. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were lessons, warnings, and affirmations of shared values. For example, in Celtic traditions, groves were often linked to the Druids, who used them as spaces for teaching and ritual. The trees themselves became characters in tales that explained the origins of the world or the behavior of nature, lessons that shaped how people understood their place in the cosmos. In India, sacred groves known as devasthans were often dedicated to local deities and became centers of community life. Festivals and rituals held in these spaces reinforced social bonds and celebrated the interconnectedness of humans and nature. Similarly, in West Africa, groves were sites of ancestor veneration, where elders would gather to share oral histories and ensure that the wisdom of the past wasn't lost. These practices weren't just about preserving the past, they were about affirming a sense of belonging and continuity in a world that was constantly changing. Even as empires rose and fell, these groves remained steadfast, serving as anchors of cultural identity. What's fascinating is how these spaces transcended their physical boundaries to become symbols of unity. They weren't just important to a single family or village, they connected entire regions through shared reverence. This sense of continuity was especially crucial in times of upheaval, when communities faced displacement or external threats. The groves became places of refuge not just for people but for the stories and traditions that defined them. They reminded people of who they were and where they came from, offering a sense of stability in an uncertain world. Even today, many of these traditions persist, a testament to the enduring power of sacred groves as keepers of cultural heritage. Sacred groves weren't just isolated spaces of natural beauty or spiritual reverence, they were the beating hearts of ancient communities. Think of them as the town squares of their time, places where people gathered not only to worship but to connect, celebrate, and collaborate. These groves became the backdrop for festivals that brought entire villages together, where music, dance, and storytelling intertwined with rituals and traditions. Imagine the vibrant atmosphere as families and neighbors gathered under the canopy of ancient trees, sharing food, laughter, and a sense of unity. But these gatherings weren't just about celebration. Sacred groves also served as neutral grounds for resolving disputes and making important communal decisions. In a time before formal courts or town halls, these spaces provided a sense of impartiality, where elders and leaders could mediate conflicts under the watchful presence of the divine. The shared respect for the sacredness of the grove helped to foster mutual understanding and compromise, strengthening the social fabric of the community. Beyond their practical role, these groves also acted as repositories of collective memory. Stories passed down through generations were often tied to these spaces, making them living archives of a community's history and identity. Whether it was a seasonal festival marking the harvest or a solemn gathering to honor ancestors, every event held in the grove reinforced a sense of belonging and continuity. In a world where life was deeply intertwined with nature, these spaces became essential not just for survival but for the very spirit of togetherness. The role of sacred groves as community hubs reminds us of the profound ways in which natural spaces can shape human connections. They weren't just places of isolation or quiet reflection. They were vibrant, dynamic centers where life unfolded in all its complexity. Through festivals, meetings, and shared rituals, these groves became the glue that held communities together, proving that even in the most ancient of times, the need for connection and unity was as vital as the air we breathe. Sacred groves weren't just physical spaces, they were woven into the very fabric of ancient mythology. These places often served as the backdrop for some of the most profound stories ever told, connecting the natural world to the divine in ways that shaped entire cultures. Take the Greeks, for instance. Their sacred groves were said to be inhabited by nymphs, spirits of nature who protected the trees and springs. These nymphs weren't just folklore, they were central to myths that explained the origins of life, the changing seasons, and even human virtues. When people entered these groves, they weren't just stepping into a forest, they were walking into a myth, a place where gods and mortals intertwined. The Celts, too, had their own rich traditions tied to sacred groves. Druids, the spiritual leaders of Celtic society, believed these spaces were gateways to the otherworld, a realm beyond human understanding. Legends tell of heroic figures like Cuchulainn, who sought wisdom and strength in these groves, often after great trials or battles. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were lessons in courage, morality, and the sacredness of nature. By linking their myths to these spaces, the Celts reinforced the idea that the groves were not just important, but essential to their cultural identity. In Norse mythology, sacred groves were often associated with Yggdrasil, the immense tree that held the 9 worlds together. This wasn't just a symbolic image, it was a way to explain the interconnectedness of all life. The groves themselves were seen as reflections of Yggdrasil, places where one could feel closer to the cosmos and the gods who shaped it. These myths gave meaning to the groves, transforming them from ordinary forests into sacred sanctuaries that held the secrets of the universe. What's fascinating is how these stories across different cultures served a similar purpose. They didn't just explain the world, they gave people a reason to protect it. By tying creation stories and heroic deeds to these spaces, ancient societies ensured that sacred groves were revered, not just as places of worship, but as living embodiments of their deepest beliefs. The myths weren't just tales, they were a way of preserving the sanctity of nature for generations to come. Picture this: deep within the heart of a forgotten forest, archaeologists uncover an ancient altar, its surface weathered by centuries of wind and rain. This isn't just a pile of stones, it's a window into a world long lost, a tangible connection to the spiritual practices of our ancestors. Archaeologists have unearthed countless discoveries like this in sacred groves, each one offering a piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding the beliefs and rituals of ancient cultures. Take, for example, the sacred groves of ancient Greece, where inscriptions carved into stone reveal prayers and offerings made to the gods. These aren't random etchings but deliberate acts of devotion, a way of communicating with the divine in spaces believed to be especially holy. In Scandinavia, sacred groves known as hurga have yielded artifacts like amulets and ritual tools, hinting at ceremonies performed under the canopy of ancient trees. These objects weren't just functional, they were infused with spiritual significance, used to honor the gods or seek their favor. And in India, archaeological finds in sacred groves include intricate carvings and statues, often depicting deities or mythological scenes. These artifacts tell us that these spaces weren't just places of worship, but also centers of storytelling and cultural memory, where legends were preserved and passed down through generations. But it's not just about the objects themselves, it's what they reveal about the people who left them behind. The placement of altars, the choice of offerings, even the way artifacts are arranged all provide clues about the rituals and beliefs of these ancient communities. For instance, the discovery of animal bones near altars suggests that sacrifices were a common practice, while the presence of personal items like jewelry or tools might indicate that these groves were also places for individual prayer or healing. Each discovery adds another layer to our understanding, helping historians and archaeologists reconstruct the spiritual lives of people who lived thousands of years ago. What's truly fascinating is how these findings connect us to the past in a way that's almost tactile. Holding an ancient artifact or standing before a weathered altar, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe, a reminder that these groves were more than just physical spaces. They were places where the sacred and the everyday intersected, where the natural world was seen as alive with meaning. Through these archaeological discoveries, we're not just learning about history, we're glimpsing the worldview of those who saw the world as interconnected, where every tree, rock, and stream held a story waiting to be told. Among the many elements that made sacred groves so significant, the trees themselves held a special place in the hearts and minds of ancient people. These weren't just ordinary trees, they were symbols of life, power, and divine connection. Take the oak, for example. In countless cultures, the oak stood as a mighty representation of strength and endurance. Its towering presence and deep roots made it a natural symbol of stability, often linked to gods of thunder and sky, like Zeus in Greek mythology or Thor in Norse traditions. For ancient communities, the oak wasn't just a tree, it was a living testament to resilience and the enduring power of nature. Then there's the cedar, a tree steeped in both practical and spiritual significance. In ancient Mesopotamia, the cedar was considered a sacred tree, often associated with protection and purification. Its aromatic wood was used in temples and royal palaces, believed to ward off evil spirits and bring divine favor. The cedar's towering height and fragrant scent made it a bridge between the earthly and the divine, a reminder of humanity's connection to something greater than themselves. And who could overlook the fig tree, a symbol of abundance and fertility in many ancient cultures? In places like India and the Mediterranean, the fig tree was revered for its life-giving fruit and its ability to thrive in harsh conditions. Its broad, sheltering branches became a place of gathering where people would come to share stories, seek wisdom, or simply find respite. The fig tree wasn't just a source of nourishment, it was a symbol of community and the cycles of life. These trees weren't chosen at random, each held qualities that resonated deeply with the people who venerated them. Their longevity mirrored the timeless nature of the divine. Their strength reflected the endurance of the human spirit, and their medicinal properties offered a tangible way to heal and protect. In sacred groves, these trees became more than just plants. They were living symbols of the sacred, weaving together the spiritual and practical lives of ancient people in ways that still echo through history today. Imagine a bubbling spring nestled in the heart of a dense forest, its crystal-clear waters flowing gently into a serene river. For ancient people, places like this weren't just sources of fresh water, they were sacred. These natural oases were often found within or near sacred groves, creating a powerful connection between the spiritual and the life-giving. Water was more than a resource, it was a symbol of purity, renewal, and divine presence. In many ancient cultures, springs, rivers, and lakes were believed to be gateways to the spiritual realm, places where the gods or nature spirits dwelled. These water sources were thought to carry blessings, healing properties, and even messages from the divine. By associating them with sacred groves, ancient people reinforced the idea that these spaces were not only physically essential but also spiritually vital. Protecting the groves meant protecting the water and vice versa, ensuring the survival of both the body and the soul. This connection wasn't just symbolic, it was practical too. Sacred groves often served as natural watersheds, helping to maintain the purity and flow of nearby water sources. Ancient societies understood this ecological relationship intuitively, long before modern science could explain it. By preserving these groves, they safeguarded their water supply, ensuring their communities could thrive. In some cultures, rituals and offerings were performed at these sites to honor the spirits of the water and the land. These practices weren't just acts of devotion, they were a way of acknowledging the interdependence of all life. The sacred groves and the water they protected became living symbols of this harmony, reminding people of their responsibility to care for the earth and its resources. Even today, the legacy of these ancient beliefs can be seen in the way certain natural sites are revered. The connection between sacred groves and water sources highlights a timeless understanding that the spiritual and the natural are deeply intertwined and that both deserve our respect and protection. In the heart of these ancient sacred groves, there were figures who stood as the bridge between the human and the divine: priests, shamans, and druids. These individuals were not just caretakers of the physical space, but also spiritual guardians, entrusted with maintaining the sanctity of these natural temples. Their roles were multifaceted, blending ritual, wisdom, and authority in ways that profoundly shaped the communities they served. One of their primary responsibilities was conducting ceremonies that connected people to the sacred. Whether it was offerings to the gods, seasonal celebrations, or rites of passage, these rituals transformed the groves into places of deep spiritual significance. The act of performing these ceremonies within the groves reinforced the belief that these spaces were alive with divine presence, a belief that bound communities together. But their duties went beyond rituals. Priests, shamans, and druids were also interpreters of the natural world. They read omens in the rustling of leaves, the flight of birds, or the patterns of the stars. These interpretations often guided decisions in matters ranging from agriculture to warfare, making these spiritual leaders vital advisors in both mundane and extraordinary circumstances. Their role as protectors of the groves was equally important. They ensured that these spaces remained undisturbed, enforcing strict rules about what could and could not be done within their boundaries. This stewardship preserved the groves not just as places of worship, but as sanctuaries of biodiversity, untouched by the demands of everyday life. In many ways, these figures were the spiritual anchors of their societies, wielding influence that extended far beyond the groves themselves. Their presence reminded people that the sacred was not distant or abstract, but woven into the very fabric of the natural world. Through their actions, they preserved a connection to the divine that has fascinated and inspired countless generations. In the turbulent tides of ancient warfare, sacred groves often found themselves at the heart of the storm. These revered spaces, meant to be sanctuaries of peace, were sometimes thrust into the chaos of battle, becoming symbols of both defiance and destruction. For invading armies, the decision to protect or destroy a sacred grove was never just tactical, it was deeply symbolic. To spare a grove was to show respect for the spiritual and cultural identity of the conquered people, a gesture that could ease tensions and foster acceptance. But to destroy one was to strike at the very soul of a community, a deliberate act of erasure meant to assert dominance and sever ties to the past. Take, for example, the conquests of Alexander the Great. When his armies swept through Persia, they encountered sacred groves tied to the Zoroastrian faith. In some cases, Alexander ordered these groves to be preserved, recognizing their importance to the local population and using their protection as a tool to win hearts and minds. Yet in other instances, groves were razed to the ground, their destruction serving as a brutal reminder of the cost of resistance. These contrasting actions reveal a complex interplay between strategy and spirituality, where sacred groves became pawns in a larger game of power and control. Similarly, in ancient Britain, the Roman invasion brought both reverence and ruin to the Druidic groves. The Romans, known for assimilating local gods into their pantheon, sometimes protected these groves as a way to integrate with the native population. But when the Druids resisted Roman rule, their groves were targeted as centers of rebellion, their sacred trees cut down and their altars desecrated. This duality, protection and destruction, highlights how sacred groves were not just physical spaces, but also powerful symbols of identity and resistance. Even in times of war, these groves could serve as unexpected havens. There are accounts of armies from opposing sides agreeing to halt fighting within the boundaries of a sacred grove, honoring its sanctity even in the midst of conflict. Such moments remind us that, despite the brutality of warfare, a shared reverence for the sacred could sometimes transcend the divisions of battle. Through these stories, we see how sacred groves were far more than mere collections of trees. They were living embodiments of a people's beliefs, history, and resilience. Whether shielded or shattered, their fate in war speaks volumes about the values, fears, and ambitions of the societies that fought over them. As ancient civilizations evolved, so too did their relationship with the natural world, and with it, the fate of their sacred groves. These once thriving sanctuaries, deeply woven into the spiritual fabric of societies, began to fade in prominence. One of the most significant drivers of this decline was urbanization. As cities expanded, the demand for land and resources grew. Forests were cleared to make way for homes, roads, and infrastructure, often at the expense of these sacred spaces. The groves, once seen as untouchable, were now viewed as obstacles to progress, their spiritual significance overshadowed by the practical needs of a growing population. Religious shifts also played a pivotal role. As new belief systems emerged and old ones transformed, the rituals and practices tied to sacred groves began to lose their relevance. What was once a cornerstone of spiritual life became a relic of the past, no longer central to the evolving religious identities of these societies. This shift wasn't just about faith, it was a change in how people connected with the natural world. The groves, once revered as bridges between the earthly and the divine, were gradually abandoned, their sacred purpose forgotten. Industrialization accelerated this decline even further. The rise of machinery, factories, and large-scale agriculture demanded vast amounts of natural resources. Forests were harvested for timber, and land was repurposed for industrial use. The ecological balance that had sustained these groves for centuries was disrupted, leaving them vulnerable to destruction. What had been sanctuaries of tranquility and biodiversity became casualties of a new era driven by efficiency and expansion. The loss of these groves wasn't just a physical transformation, it was a spiritual and ecological one as well. Ancient communities lost a tangible connection to their ancestors, their gods, and the natural world. The groves had served as places of worship, healing, and communal gathering, and their disappearance left a void in both the cultural and environmental landscapes. The biodiversity they once protected dwindled, and the lessons they taught about living in harmony with nature were buried beneath the march of progress. Yet, even in their decline, the legacy of sacred groves endures. They remind us of a time when humans saw themselves not as separate from nature, but as part of it, a perspective that feels increasingly relevant in our modern world. As we reflect on their history, we're left to wonder, what might we learn from these ancient spaces, and how can we apply their wisdom to the challenges we face today? Even today, in a world dominated by urbanization and technology, sacred groves still exist as living relics of ancient traditions. These pockets of untouched wilderness scattered across the globe serve as windows into a time when nature and spirituality were deeply intertwined. In India, for example, sacred groves known as devrais or kavas are found in states like Maharashtra, Kerala, and Karnataka. These groves are dedicated to local deities or spirits, and the communities surrounding them have maintained strict taboos against cutting trees or disturbing the land for centuries. The result is a thriving ecosystem, often containing rare plants and animals that have vanished from surrounding areas. Japan's sacred groves, often associated with Shinto shrines, offer another fascinating example. Known as Shinju no Mori, these forests are considered the dwelling places of kami or spirits and are meticulously preserved by shrine caretakers and local residents. The towering cryptomeria trees and serene pathways of places like the Meiji Shrine in Tokyo or the ancient Kasuga Taisha in Nara transport visitors into a timeless realm where the natural and spiritual worlds merge. In West Africa, particularly in countries like Ghana and Nigeria, sacred groves continue to play a vital role in community life. These groves, often linked to ancestor worship or traditional beliefs, are protected as sanctuaries for both cultural and ecological reasons. Rituals, festivals, and ceremonies held within these spaces keep ancient customs alive, while the groves themselves act as vital reservoirs of biodiversity in regions facing deforestation. The enduring reverence for these groves speaks to something profound, a universal human need to connect with the natural world on a deeper, more sacred level. They remind us that these spaces are not just relics of the past but living, breathing links to our shared history. As modern society grapples with environmental crises, the wisdom of these ancient traditions offers a powerful lesson in how to coexist with nature in a way that honors both its beauty and its sacredness. What can ancient sacred groves teach us about protecting our planet today? Surprisingly, quite a lot. The reverence ancient cultures held for these natural spaces wasn't just spiritual, it was also deeply practical. By safeguarding these groves, they preserved biodiversity, maintained ecological balance, and ensured resources for future generations. Sound familiar? These are the very principles modern conservationists strive for. Today, as we face deforestation, climate change, and habitat destruction, the wisdom of the past offers a powerful blueprint for the future. Sacred groves remind us that nature isn't just a resource to exploit but a vital partner in our survival. Modern movements like reforestation projects and the push for sustainable living echo this ancient philosophy. Think about it, when we plant trees or protect endangered species, we're honoring the same belief that nature deserves respect and care. And it's not just about the environment, it's about our connection to it. Sacred groves were places of community, reflection, and renewal, and today's green spaces, parks, forests, and urban gardens serve a similar purpose. They're not just areas to visit, they're essential for our well-being. By learning from the past, we can create a future where humanity and nature thrive together. The principles behind sacred groves aren't relics of history, they're timeless lessons for a sustainable world. Sacred groves, often seen as remnants of ancient spiritual practices, hold profound lessons for our modern world, especially in the face of climate change. These pockets of untouched nature aren't just relics of the past, they're living ecosystems that play a vital role in our planet's health. One of their most significant contributions is their ability to act as carbon sinks. The dense, ancient trees found in these groves store vast amounts of carbon dioxide, one of the primary drivers of global warming. By preserving and expanding sacred groves, we're essentially creating natural reservoirs that help mitigate the effects of climate change, one tree at a time. But their value doesn't stop there. Sacred groves are also biodiversity hotspots, sheltering countless plant and animal species that might otherwise struggle to survive in fragmented landscapes. In a world where habitats are disappearing at an alarming rate, these groves offer a sanctuary where life can thrive. They're like living laboratories, showcasing how diverse ecosystems can coexist in harmony, something we desperately need to replicate on a larger scale. This isn't just about conservation, it's about understanding how nature works when left undisturbed and applying those lessons to our own efforts in sustainable land management. And here's where sacred groves truly shine as models for the future. For centuries, they've been managed sustainably, often with minimal human interference. The communities that protect these spaces do so with a deep respect for the balance of nature, a mindset that's increasingly relevant as we grapple with deforestation, soil degradation, and other environmental crises. By studying how sacred groves have been preserved, we can uncover strategies for managing land in ways that are both ecologically sound and culturally meaningful. What's more, these groves remind us that combating climate change isn't just about technology or policy, it's about reconnecting with the natural world. They challenge us to think differently about our relationship with the environment, to see it not as a resource to exploit, but as a partner in sustaining life. In a time when the climate crisis feels overwhelming, sacred groves offer both a tangible solution and a profound source of hope. They're a testament to the fact that even small, sacred spaces can have a big impact on the health of our planet. While sacred groves are often associated with male figures like priests or tribal leaders, the role of women in these spaces is a story that has been quietly woven into the fabric of history. Women weren't just passive participants in these sacred landscapes, they were often the lifeblood of their preservation and spiritual significance. From priestesses who conducted rituals to healers who drew on the medicinal power of plants, women held a unique and essential role in the stewardship of these groves. In many ancient cultures, priestesses acted as intermediaries between the divine and the earthly realm, performing ceremonies that honored the spirits believed to reside in the groves. These women were deeply connected to the natural world, interpreting signs from the environment to guide their communities. For example, in pre-Christian Europe, certain groves were tended by priestesses who conducted ceremonies tied to seasonal cycles, ensuring that both the land and the people remained in harmony. Beyond their spiritual duties, women often served as healers, drawing on the knowledge of sacred plants found within these groves. They understood the medicinal properties of herbs, roots, and leaves, using this wisdom to treat ailments and strengthen their communities. This dual role, as both spiritual and practical caretakers, made them indispensable guardians of these spaces. Their work wasn't just about maintaining the groves, it was about nurturing the well-being of everyone who relied on them. Women also played a crucial part in passing down traditions and knowledge. In many societies, oral histories and ecological practices were preserved and transmitted through generations by women. They taught younger members of their communities how to care for the groves, ensuring that sacred practices and environmental wisdom were not lost. This intergenerational role made them key figures in the continuity of cultural and ecological heritage. What's truly remarkable is how these women balanced their roles as spiritual leaders, healers, and educators, often with little recognition from historical records. Their contributions were so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life that they sometimes went unnoticed, yet their impact was profound. By protecting these groves, they not only safeguarded the environment, but also preserved the spiritual and cultural identity of their communities. Their legacy reminds us that sacred groves were more than just physical spaces, they were living ecosystems of human and natural interaction, sustained by the dedication of women who understood their value in ways that went beyond the surface. Their stories invite us to reconsider how we view these ancient sites and the people who truly kept them alive. Sacred groves have long been a source of inspiration, capturing the imagination of artists, poets, and storytellers across cultures. In ancient art, these spaces were often portrayed as ethereal sanctuaries, where the divine and the natural world intertwined. Greek pottery, for instance, frequently featured groves as the backdrop for mythological scenes, with figures like Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, depicted amidst towering trees and lush foliage. These images weren't just decorative, they conveyed a profound respect for the groves as places where gods walked among mortals. Similarly, in ancient Indian literature, sacred groves were celebrated in texts like the Vedas and the Puranas. The Mahabharata describes groves as tranquil retreats where sages meditated and performed rituals, emphasizing their role as bridges between the earthly and the spiritual realms. These depictions weren't just literary devices, They reflected the cultural belief that groves were imbued with a sacred energy, a force that could inspire enlightenment and transformation. In Norse mythology, groves were central to the worship of deities like Freya, the god of fertility and prosperity. The sagas often describe these spaces as hallowed grounds, where rituals were conducted to ensure bountiful harvests and communal well-being. Here, the groves weren't just physical locations, they were symbols of life, growth, and the interconnectedness of all things. Even in ancient Chinese poetry, groves were a recurring motif, often symbolizing harmony between humanity and nature. Poets like Tao Yuanming wrote of secluded groves as places of refuge where one could escape the chaos of the world and find inner peace. These verses weren't just beautiful, they were a testament to the grove's enduring role as spiritual havens. What's striking about these artistic and literary depictions is how they transcend time and geography. Whether in Greek myths, Indian scriptures, Norse sagas, or Chinese poetry, sacred groves are consistently portrayed as places of mystery, reverence, and connection. These creative expressions didn't just capture the beauty of the groves, they revealed how deeply ingrained they were in the collective consciousness of ancient cultures. Through art and literature, the sacred groves became more than physical spaces. They became symbols of humanity's quest for meaning and a deeper relationship with the natural world. Ancient peoples may not have had the tools or language of modern science, but their reverence for sacred groves and forests was rooted in a profound connection to nature. Today, as we uncover the ecological benefits of these spaces, we're finding that their spiritual significance aligns with scientific understanding in fascinating ways. Sacred groves, often preserved for centuries, serve as living laboratories where the wisdom of the past meets the discoveries of the present. Take, for instance, research on biodiversity in sacred groves. Studies have shown that these areas are hotspots for plant and animal life, often harboring species that have disappeared from surrounding regions. In parts of India, sacred groves act as critical refuges for endangered flora and fauna, preserving ecosystems that would otherwise be lost to deforestation or development. This isn't just coincidence, it's evidence of how ancient practices, driven by spiritual beliefs, inadvertently protected the natural world, but the benefits go beyond biodiversity. Sacred groves also play a vital role in maintaining ecological balance. They act as natural watersheds, preventing soil erosion and regulating water cycles. In many cultures, these groves were seen as the dwelling places of deities or spirits, and their protection was considered a sacred duty. What's remarkable is that modern environmental science now confirms the importance of preserving such areas for the health of our planet. The cultural significance of these spaces adds another layer to their ecological value. Sacred groves were not just physical spaces, they were centers of community life where rituals, storytelling, and traditions were passed down through generations. This deep cultural connection fostered a sense of stewardship, ensuring that these areas remained untouched. Today, as we face global environmental challenges, this blend of spirituality and sustainability offers a powerful lesson. By studying sacred groves, we're reminded that science and spirituality aren't opposing forces, they're two sides of the same coin. Both seek to understand and protect the natural world, just through different lenses. As we continue to explore these ancient spaces, we're not only uncovering ecological insights, but also rediscovering a timeless connection to the earth that can guide us toward a more harmonious future. There's something almost magical about the stillness of a forest, the way sunlight filters through leaves and the gentle rustling of branches in the wind. For ancient people, sacred groves weren't just physical spaces, they were sanctuaries of the mind and spirit. These tranquil environments offered a rare opportunity to step away from the chaos of daily life and turn inward. Meditation and reflection were central to the purpose of these groves, serving as pathways to deeper self-awareness and spiritual growth. Imagine standing in the heart of a sacred grove, surrounded by towering trees and the subtle hum of nature. For many ancient cultures, this was the ideal setting to quiet the mind and connect with the divine. The act of meditating in such a space was believed to bring clarity, peace, and even visions. It's no wonder that these groves were often associated with gods and goddesses, as they seemed to bridge the gap between the earthly and the eternal. But the benefits of these practices weren't just spiritual. Spending time in nature has profound psychological and emotional effects, something that modern science is only beginning to fully understand. Ancient people seem to instinctively recognize this, using sacred groves as natural therapy spaces. The calming presence of trees, the scent of earth, and the rhythm of natural sounds all contributed to a sense of well-being. It's a feeling that's hard to put into words but is universally familiar, a kind of grounding that soothes the soul. This ancient wisdom finds its echo in modern practices like forest bathing or Shinrin-yoku, a Japanese tradition that encourages mindful immersion in nature. Studies have shown that spending time in forests can reduce stress, lower blood pressure, and even boost the immune system. It's fascinating to see how these contemporary practices align with the rituals of the past, proving that the human need for connection with nature is timeless. Sacred groves remind us that the natural world is more than just a resource. It's a teacher, a healer, and a mirror for our inner selves. Whether it's through ancient meditation or modern forest bathing, the act of stepping into these green sanctuaries offers a chance to pause, reflect, and rediscover what it means to be truly alive. Animals played a pivotal role in the sacred groves of ancient civilizations, often serving as living symbols of the divine. These creatures weren't just inhabitants of these spaces, they were deeply woven into the spiritual and ecological fabric of the groves. In many traditions, specific animals were seen as messengers or manifestations of gods, carrying omens or blessings to those who entered the sacred space. For instance, in Celtic lore, the stag was revered as a symbol of the forest spirit, embodying both strength and renewal. Similarly, in Hindu tradition, the peacock was associated with deities like Saraswati and Kartikeya, its vibrant feathers representing beauty and spiritual awakening. These groves weren't just places of worship, they were also sanctuaries for wildlife. Ancient cultures often enacted strict protections for animals within these spaces, recognizing their sacredness. In some cases, harming or hunting certain species within the grove was considered a grave offense, punishable by divine retribution. This reverence wasn't just about spirituality, it reflected a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of life. By protecting these animals, ancient people preserved the delicate balance of their ecosystems, ensuring that both nature and their spiritual practices thrived. One fascinating example comes from ancient Greece, where the oak groves dedicated to Zeus were home to the sacred eagle, believed to be the king of the gods' personal messenger. The presence of these majestic birds was seen as a sign of Zeus's favor, and their protection was paramount. Similarly, in the sacred groves of Japan, the Shinto tradition honored the fox as a messenger of Inari, the god of rice and fertility. These animals weren't just symbols, they were active participants in the rituals and myths that shaped daily life. The role of animals in these groves also extended to storytelling. Myths and legends often featured creatures as central characters, imparting moral lessons or explaining natural phenomena. The serpent, for example, appears in countless traditions, sometimes as a symbol of wisdom, other times as a guardian of hidden knowledge. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were a way for ancient cultures to pass down their values and understanding of the world. By examining the role of animals in sacred groves, we gain insight into how ancient people viewed their relationship with nature. These creatures were more than mere inhabitants. They were integral to the spiritual and ecological harmony of these spaces. And while the specifics of these beliefs varied across cultures, one common thread remains: a profound respect for the natural world and its inhabitants. This reverence reminds us of the timeless connection between humanity, spirituality, and the environment. In many ancient cultures, sacred groves weren't just places of reverence for the living. They were also deeply intertwined with beliefs about the afterlife. These serene, secluded spaces were often viewed as thresholds, where the boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead blurred. For countless communities, sacred groves served as a kind of bridge, a place where the physical and spiritual realms could meet. One of the most fascinating aspects of this connection is how sacred groves functioned as burial grounds or sites for ancestral worship. In some traditions, these groves were chosen as resting places for the deceased, believed to be portals where souls could journey peacefully into the next world. The trees themselves, towering and eternal, were seen as guardians of these sacred transitions. They provided shelter not just for the living but for the spirits of ancestors who were thought to remain connected to their descendants through the grove's enduring presence. Ancestral worship added another layer of significance to these spaces. Many cultures believed that the spirits of the dead continued to influence the lives of the living, and sacred groves became places where this connection was nurtured. Rituals, offerings, and ceremonies were conducted within these groves to honor ancestors, seek their guidance, and maintain harmony between the generations. The grove, in this sense, was a living archive of memory and continuity, where the past and present coexisted in a delicate balance. This belief in sacred groves as transitional zones also reflects a broader understanding of nature as a mediator between worlds. The trees, with their roots buried deep in the earth and their branches reaching toward the heavens, symbolized the journey of the soul, from the earthly realm to the divine. It's a powerful reminder of how ancient people saw themselves as part of a larger, interconnected cycle, where life, death, and the natural world were inseparable. As we explore these ideas, it's clear that sacred groves were far more than just physical spaces. They were deeply spiritual landscapes woven into the very fabric of how people understood their place in the universe. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy that continues to inspire us today. Across the globe, in every corner of the world, you'll find sacred groves that have been revered for centuries, each one a unique reflection of the culture that holds it dear. Take the ancient Celtic tribes of Europe, for instance, who worshipped in oak groves they believed were gateways to the divine. These towering trees, with their deep roots and expansive canopies, symbolized strength and eternity, serving as natural temples where rituals and ceremonies connected the earthly realm to the spiritual. Journey east to Japan, and you'll encounter a different kind of sacred forest altogether. Here, the majestic cedar trees of places like the Kumano region stand as silent witnesses to centuries of Shinto practices. These forests, often surrounding shrines, are seen as the dwelling places of kami or spirits, and walking through them is considered a form of purification. The reverence for these groves isn't just about the trees themselves, but the profound sense of harmony they represent between humans, nature, and the unseen world. In India, sacred groves known as devrais dot the landscape, often teeming with biodiversity. These pockets of untouched wilderness are dedicated to local deities and are protected by communities who believe that harming them would bring divine retribution. From the Western Ghats to the tribal lands of central India, these groves are not just spiritual sanctuaries but also vital ecological havens, preserving plant and animal species that might otherwise be lost. And let's not forget the sacred groves of West Africa, where communities have long revered forested areas as the homes of ancestral spirits. Here, the groves are places of prayer, healing, and communal gatherings, with every tree, stream, and rock carrying a story passed down through generations. These spaces are more than just physical locations, they're woven into the very identity of the people who protect them. What's fascinating is how these groves, though separated by vast distances and vastly different cultures, share a common thread, a deep, almost universal reverence for nature. Whether it's the Celts under their oak canopies, the Japanese among their cedars, or the tribes of India and Africa in their sacred forests, these spaces remind us of something profound, that humanity has always recognized nature as something sacred, something worth protecting. And perhaps in a world where we're increasingly disconnected from the natural world, these ancient traditions have something important to teach us about finding balance and respect for the earth. Sacred groves are not just relics of the past, they are living, breathing connections to our shared history. If we lose these spaces, we lose a piece of our collective identity. Across the globe, sacred groves face threats from deforestation, urbanization, and climate change. The good news is, there's a growing movement to protect and restore these irreplaceable sites, ensuring they survive for generations to come. One inspiring example is the work of the Sacred Natural Sites Initiative, an organization dedicated to preserving these spaces by collaborating with local communities, governments, and researchers. Their approach is rooted in respect for traditional knowledge, recognizing that the people who have long cared for these groves hold the key to their survival. By empowering these communities, the initiative helps ensure that ancient practices and wisdom continue to thrive alongside modern conservation efforts. Another remarkable effort comes from the World Wildlife Fund, which has partnered with indigenous groups to protect sacred groves in regions like the Amazon and Southeast Asia. These partnerships not only safeguard biodiversity but also strengthen cultural heritage, showing that conservation and tradition can go hand in hand. But you don't have to be part of a large organization to make a difference. Simple actions like supporting local conservation projects, spreading awareness about the importance of sacred groves, or even visiting these sites with respect and curiosity can have a meaningful impact. When we take the time to learn about these spaces, we become part of their story, a story that stretches back thousands of years and holds the potential to inspire countless more. These groves remind us of our deep connection to nature and to each other. They are not just places of worship or reflection, they are living testaments to the resilience of human culture and the natural world. By protecting them, we aren't just preserving the past, we're nurturing a legacy that future generations will cherish. So, the next time you hear about a sacred grove, take a moment to consider its significance. These spaces are more than just trees and soil. They are a bridge between the past, the present, and the future. As we've journeyed through the stories and significance of sacred groves and forests, one thing becomes undeniably clear. These ancient spaces were far more than just clusters of trees. They were the heartbeats of spiritual life, the anchors of ecological balance, and the living archives of cultural identity for countless civilizations. For ancient people, these groves were not just places to visit, they were sanctuaries to commune with the divine, to honor the cycles of nature, and to pass down the wisdom of generations. But what does this mean for us today, in a world where nature is often seen as a resource to exploit rather than a sacred partner? These ancient practices offer a profound lesson. They remind us that humanity is not separate from the natural world. We are deeply intertwined with it. The reverence ancient people held for these spaces wasn't just about tradition. It was a recognition of the delicate balance that sustains all life. And as we face modern challenges like deforestation and climate change, their wisdom feels more urgent than ever. So, what can we do with this knowledge? It starts with a shift in perspective. Imagine treating the forests and natural spaces around us not as mere backdrops to our lives, but as vital, living entities deserving of care and respect. Whether it's by visiting a sacred grove near you, supporting conservation efforts, or simply taking a moment to appreciate the natural world, each of us has the power to carry forward this ancient legacy. Let's not just admire the past, let's learn from it. The sacred groves and forests of antiquity call out to us across the ages, urging us to reconnect with the earth and to protect its fragile beauty. So take a step outside, breathe in the stillness of a forest, listen to the whispers of the trees, and remember, the wisdom of the ancients is not lost, it's waiting for us to rediscover it, one grove at a time.